I am here today at Hargrave Street on my podcast Different Matters with retired detective. What was your rank when you retired?
Sergeant.
Sergeant. A retired, but you were a detective.
Yeah, detective sergeant.
All right, Detective Sergeant Dave Chook Henwood. Everybody calls you Chook. I'm here to talk about Dave's book, Unmasking Monsters, How the Hunt for New Zealand's Worst Criminals Changed Policing Forever. Chook, thanks for coming in. Let's start with Dan Dudston. So over the course of this interview, I'm particularly interested in profiling. Right. I'm interested in your involvement, not so much in the arrest of some of the individuals, but the thinking behind profiling and its impact in New Zealand. But I want to start with Dan Dudston. Right. Who was he, and why did you need to write a book with him?
Dan was a burglar from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and, into the 90s. So been around a while, a bit older than me. And I think most detectives in north of Hamilton, anyway, would probably have a run-in with him at some stage, or know of him. An interesting character, a likeable rogue, I guess you'd describe him, but I had dealings with him. I found him interesting, entertaining, and insightful in some ways.
And why are we talking about him? There's a number of people in your book, but over your career, this is a guy that you maintained a relationship with right up until his death. Why? What was it about him? Because he was a criminal. You collared him a couple of times. He spent a fair bit of time in prison. What was it about him that has captured your imagination? Or that's the wrong word, but captured your attention?
Yeah, well, way back, probably in the early 80s, he came, the first time he came to my notice, I was aware of him because my mentor, Murray Jeffries, was a detective sergeant, and Len Johnson had locked him up in the 60s, and he had a reputation as a burglar. He'd committed more burglaries than anyone else. He had more convictions for burglary than anyone at that time. So I was aware of him, but I didn't have any connection to him at that stage. When in the early 80s, we had a homicide, and Dan brought the brother of the offender in. There was three brothers involved. One was deceased, one was the murderer, and this was the other brother. And Dan brought him in, talked him into coming in and telling us a story. So that was my first kind of run-in with him. And I got to know him, and he was living in Papatoetoe. I was a Papatoetoe boy. And he was living in Papatoetoe, and on night shift, I used to drop in and see him because he was always had the radio going beside his bed.
This was when he was in custody?
No. When he was living in Papatoetoe.
Right, so you would drop by his house?
Yeah, drop by his house. Early hours in the morning. Give him a code. I knew he'd be listening to the police radio, and give him 5 minutes to get rid of any stolen gear. He wouldn't let me in the house. So, he'd and we'd have a cup of coffee, and chat about things. He wasn't ever an informant. Never. People didn't believe me, but he was never an informant. He'd talk about other criminals he'd been in prison with, and it was enlightening for me. I mean, I suppose I've been in the job for 12 years by that stage, but it was an interesting kind of to understand, to see people with a different eye, and some of these well-known offenders from the 60s and 70s, bad people that were known to all of us police officers, and he could give us the insight on what they were like.
But I don't quite buy that. So you're saying that there was a tactical reason to be involved with him. But from reading the book, I get the sense that there was because your relationship continued after your involvement with the police ended. So there was obviously something about him as a person that transcended his career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was a witty character. Crumpish kind of humour, and and I liked it. And we had an understanding fairly early on, and certainly consolidated when he went in the last time, that we wouldn't bullshit each other, and he didn't. And he said, I remember him saying little bits and pieces. Some of his comments were really classical, and some of them are in the book, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, all I've got left is my word. And it didn't matter whether he gave it to another criminal or a detective.
Which is why he never informed.
Yeah, he never informed. And if you followed up what he said, I never found him to have lied to me. He may have, and I don't doubt that a lot of his stories were stretched considerably, but that's still part of a raconteur's woman life, isn't it?
It is.
So yeah, I liked the guy because he was witty, and it was no mucking around with him, and it was just funny. I think as it went on, Phil Taylor, who you probably know, also had dealings with Dan, and I knew Phil. So
Phil was the writer.
Yeah, Phil's a journalist. And we used, and a couple of times there we went around to his house, usually around Christmas time, and we'd sit down, and there's Phil, a lefty. I come from a dairy farming background, which is pretty conservative, although I'd worked in South Auckland for that long that I'd probably become a little bit more centre than where my parents had been. And the other one present was Dan Dudson. So we had we didn't always agree on everything, but the humour carried the day. And
so this was after your time in the police.
Yeah.
So what was the appeal for Dan in maintaining a friendship with you?
He liked to talk and yarn, and I liked to listen to him because he could tell you from the other side of the cell door, really, and you get to kind of feel for what he's thinking and what he's doing, and what he's about, really, the kind of the person that he is. He's just a likeable rogue, as I said, and I liked him.
You write at one point that he was. You actually wrote him not a reference is the wrong term. You wrote him something for a sentencing at one point in the book, but then you talk about a time where he was forced to confront the victims of some of his burglaries.
Yeah, I had this secondhand, but yeah, he was forced, and he couldn't see. We come from different worlds, really, and he couldn't understand why someone, for example, who had their house burgled. A lot of people used to store their jewellery in their underpants and women's underpants drawer and this kind of thing. And I said, well, realise that some of those women felt completely gutted by the fact that you were there, and they had to burn all their underpants because you had been in there. He just was stunned. This was just weird for him. And when he confronted a burglar victim and had to kind of talk to him about it, he just thought it was another. Just all he was doing was burgling someone's house, and the insurance company would pay. That was his way of looking at it.
Well, you also write at one point when he was out and free, there was a car accident, and his assumption was the insurance money would just appear. Like it was a costless transaction.
Yeah.
Why do you think he stopped?
I think he matured, grew up. He didn't want to go back in. And I think the last visit to Mount Eden in the early 90s, the world had changed. It had moved on, as it does for all of us.
Yes.
Sadly. And he sat there, and it was just a terrorist training camp now, compared with what it was like in the 60s and 70s. And he said, one of the things he said, which really struck me, was he said, you couldn't have a sensible conversation in prison. There's nobody in there worth talking to anymore. Whereas back in the day, there was some intelligent people in prison, in some of those prisons that were you could sit down and talk to and yarn with. But now that was all gone. It was run by gangs. Just brutal.
You quote something that I'm not talking just off air. Most of the listeners know a bit more about my past than perhaps you do, which makes the following statement from Dan really interesting. So this is Dan Dudson. This was after he had... So this was from his manuscript. So originally you were going to write a book with him alternating Chook and Crook, I think it was. I read somewhere. he died, you picked up a copy of his manuscript, and this is what one of the that was in it. The grey preceding crime is a mental no man's land that preys on boys, taking a psychological edge. It rewards them with illusions of immense benefits and profits for small investments of time and motion. Even when the crime is actually only a sin, the formula remains the same. Rewards in seconds, paid for in years. This is what I did not see then, and therefore could not discover for myself for many years. I thought that was interesting. Did that give you because he wasn't the only criminal that you maintained a connection with. You talk about the Josie twins.
Mm.
You also talk about, you don't mention his name, you seem to describe him as some ratbag that you got into a Maori school in St. Stephen's or something that didn't work out.
Mm.
So I just want to go back, because we're talking about a different time when police officers were obviously much closer, not just to the community, but also to the criminal world that they were managing.
Yeah, I think so. And I mentioned it in the book. What happened, it was probably going to happen anyway, but what brought it about to me, in my eyes, was the end of those long interviews we used to have. You know, we just chat and talk. It was pretty, it was just a drifting on about anything, really, just chatting. But it was a little wee tiny connection that we had with them. And they found out a bit about us, and we found out a bit about them. Now it's just a clinical exercise with a DVD or a CD interview or whatever it is, a video it used to be, and it's so clinical. It's kind of, you give all these warnings, and they sit there and they say nothing, and it's just rubbish. That connection's all gone.
Is that also potentially a function of the crimes that have been policed? So particularly when you're dealing with drugs and the amount of money involved, and I guess in some ways the professionalisation of that world makes it much more difficult. Because if you're dealing with people like Dan Dudson, that's very different from dealing with somebody who's looking at 15 years for importing vast amounts of methamphetamine.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I didn't interview that many people in relation to drugs. It wasn't my scene. But, I've locked up and interviewed many murderers and rapists. They were going to go to prison for a lot longer than that. I mean, Joseph Thompson went to prison for 30 years. He's still there. And Malcolm Rowe was still in there. I mean, you can still talk to these people. You're right about the professionalism, but I think there's already been created a gap between them and us, and lack of trust. That trust goes out the window when you can't even talk to them. I mean, to me, it does, and that's, it's where I learnt a lot about their kind of lifestyle, and just by chatting to them. And now you don't get the opportunity. That's just my view. Back in the day, it would have changed anyway, as you say, probably because of the kind of world we live in today. Shall we say?
It is. Let's talk about Trentham. So this is you decided you want to become a police officer. Your grades weren't very good, and that was the spur to knuckle down and get into Trentham. What year did you enter Trentham?
January 70.
And just give us a quick snapshot of that, because you talk about it in the book, and it sounds like it's different now. They've moved to the police college.
Police palace, yeah.
Police palace.
Yeah.
So you make it sound not quite. You make it sound like an old school boarding house with fairly strict rules and fairly inadequate food.
Yeah, it was strict, no doubt about it. I mean, we had they were little World War I tin huts, barracks they call them, and we lived in little cubicles. We had instructors that would come in the morning, and they would measure your sheet for exactly 12 inches. Your blankets had to be exactly folded right. Everything had to be correct. You had no dust, no anything. And yeah, we were confined to barracks a lot. And it was strict. We marched to meals in full parade.
What was the thinking? Why did they do that?
I think I've thought about this a lot, and I think that it was to break us down to a common place and then just build us up again? I don't know. That you'd have to ask them. I think that's been my view since then. But I have no complaint about it. It was the making of me anyway, and a lot of my mates. So how bad is it?
But that's not the way they do it now.
No, hell no.
Because, I mean, and you've actually done some teaching down at the new, what do you call it? Police Palace? I find it interesting going back and looking to that because it is kind of a different world. I kind of, looking back or looking from the outside looking in, I think whether this was by design or intention, you create a form of camaraderie through adversity, because one of the things that we are very successful in New Zealand, we have very little police corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe part of it is that environment where you are inculcated into a tribe, into a club, into a cult's the wrong word, but
gang.
A gang. That's a good description. Yeah, and so loyalty to that organisation is paramount, because we don't see a lot of evidence of police corruption in New Zealand, even now when the amount of money involved in drugs must make that enormously tempting.
I don't know about loyalty to the job as much as loyalty to each other. And that, to me, is different, because we're loyal to each other and you know where you stand. I can't, for the life of me, know how hard it must be in some corrupt police forces in the world, how you can go and investigate a crime and the guy next to you don't trust him or you don't know what he's about.
Well, we
don't have that.
We'll come to that loyalty issue a bit later when we talk about Teina Pora, because that's an interesting comment. Just before we start diving into some of the other stuff, I want to take you back, because you're talking. You started in Otahu, 19 years old. You're still a kid, and you're a police officer, and you've been called to a domestic scene, and you describe it wonderfully in the book, a domestic violence scene where the person, the guy doesn't want you there, the victim doesn't want you there, and you even comment that the damn dog didn't want you there. That must have been such a surreal world, because you were at 19, you're still a kid in so many ways, but you're wearing the uniform of the state. You're carrying around all of this authority. Did that occur to you at the time? Was it a stimulus response? What was going through your head as you were suddenly thrust into that situation? In
no man's land, really. I mean, you're right. I was naive. Even as a 19-year-old, there's some people who are a bit pretty streetwise at 19, but I certainly wasn't one of those people. And and you're right. I didn't know stuff all really about how people lived like this. I mean, I'd never seen. I didn't know a thief. I didn't know that family violence hardly existed. Until I hit the streets of South Auckland, and it's how the other people live, and it was a bloody quick learning curve, I tell you. And a lot of us went through it, and you have to lean and rely on those senior police officers who are about, and they were the making or breaking of you, really. You
moved to CIB. What is CIB? What does it stand for?
Criminal Investigation Bureau.
And so that was just, I don't quite understand. So you got your sworn police officers, but then at some point people become detectives. What's the process? What's the difference?
Well,
at least then, if not now.
Apart from the obvious that you're wearing plain clothes, but we investigate the more serious crimes.
But how does the system decide? Oh, Henwood, we want you to be a detective to have to apply. Other police officers go through their entire career and never become detectives.
It's a choice thing, and you apply. I think I mentioned in the book, I applied just to get out of the watch house because I didn't like it and being stuck inside. And
sounds like you were being bullied.
And I didn't like it inside, and it was I thought it was a very dangerous job because. When people talk about danger for police officers, you think danger on the street and that, but that's the bigger danger is the department, if somebody died in the cells down in Papakura, where the cell block was at the far end of the building, and I had to visit them every half an hour and I didn't get the chance, someone had died and I hadn't visited within the half an hour, I'm in the gun. And I thought, this is just ridiculous, I want out of here. So I applied for CIB and joined CIB. And it was as simple as that. I mean,
was there an exam? Was there a process?
Yeah, there is a process. And it's pretty stiff. It was back then. I think it still will be. We went down to, we had to do some in-service, some tests. Had to get, had to check your resting and whether you'd been in some background references. And then you went down to Trentham and did a detective induction course.
Did they teach you the law?
Oh, yeah.
So the law was
The induction course was quite a strict course, and a lot of law. I learned a lot in that induction course. It was, and any detective will tell you that, a very tough course, and it goes for a month. Finished that, then you had to do another 2 years with in-service training at the same time as you were on the street. So pretty intense. Then you went for a qualifying detective course, and then you become a detective.
How many detectives are there?
Oh, I don't know. These days or then. Quite a few. And they increased in numbers because the serious crime kept going up, didn't it? It hasn't stopped.
All right. Now we're going. So your career, I guess, is kind of defined by this case, which may be a little bit unfair, but because obviously you've done an awful lot in your career, but it also forms a big part of your book. So obviously it's pretty significant for you. And so much of it turns around what you call the South Auckland ghost. So you're now a detective. You're back in South Auckland.
I never left South Auckland.
You never left. Well, no, you went to Trentham.
Oh, yeah, for a month.
Sorry. Okay. Yep. Sorry. So the 2 years was on the job training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Okay. So how old were you when you started? When these rapes start cropping up, so the rapes start occurring in, I think the first one recorded is 1988, but that's not when you started to get involved.
First time I got involved was February 1993. So by that stage, I was a detective sergeant with 8 years as a detective sergeant. So
what sort of crimes were you in? So
yeah, we as a detective sergeant, what you do is you get promoted to detective sergeant from detective, and that was the rank I always wanted because you were one step up and you weren't kind of given all the scungy jobs and T-boy, and so you could run a homicide or run a rape inquiry or whatever, robberies, rapes, burglaries, murders, fraud. We did it all, and we saw a lot of it in South Auckland, a lot of violence, and so a rape wasn't out of the ordinary, but this one was. This one was different, and it was a rape of a woman who'd been tied up, and she was raped, and then he raped her daughter, 13-year-old daughter, as well in front of her, and we had no precursor offending that would indicate that there's nothing leading up to this, and we checked all that back, and we got nowhere, and we had a few suspects, but they fell over, and and then we had another one, and another one. So I figured it was in my patch, so this was, it was getting pretty serious, and we were very serious, and I knew there'd been a few unsolved rapes up in Otara, 20 k's up the road, in the Otahu's district, because I was in Papakuras.
Mm-hmm.
So I went up there and I got all the solved and unsolved rapes I could find, brought them all back with me, and there was heaps of them, going right back into the mid-'80s. And
there was no centralised record keeping at this point. They had the Wanganui computer, but you seem a bit dismissive of that.
Well, no, it was the filing system we had. It was filed. We filed things under complainants' names, and if you were looking for some unsolved rapes, it doesn't help you. So, and there was codings, but there was too many different types of rapes. I wasn't looking for a domestic rape. I wasn't looking for a date rape situation. We were looking at a stranger intruder rapist, and we didn't have them kind of coded like that. So I had to pull all of them out. And
So, but at this point, though, if you're doing that, you're actually already thinking, I've got one offender here.
yeah,
So at this point, you're thinking, okay, there's potentially one person involved in this.
yeah, because I knew he hadn't fallen out of the sky. He had to come from somewhere. He hadn't just come out of prison. There was no precursor offending, so he must have come from somewhere
But why
else.
did you think that was one person committing all of these rapes and not a large number of people committing the rapes?
Because they were similar.
Right.
It was a
Similar
behavioural
facts.
thing. We'd already kind of it was only based on MO at that stage because we didn't know anything really about the more ritualistic kind of behavioural clues that we later kind of got onto from reading and looking at these files. So when I got these files, I didn't even have time to do them, looking at them at work very often. So I took them home with me, which was against
the regulations, I'm
against
sure.
regulations, I'm sure, yeah. Regulations of the police and my wife, but at the time. But
And didn't you? How many? You got like 6 children.
yeah,
How'd you hide that from them?
well, they were asleep by the time I started picking those up in the early hours of the morning and reading them. So yeah, they were, yeah, they didn't get to see them. I mean, I kept as much as I could away from the kids, but you can't keep a lot of it away. A picture gets in the paper and I get interviewed and there's homicides all over the place. A taxi driver got shot just down the road from where we were living out in the country. I locked up the local rapist and these things. And they go to school with their kids, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, they know a certain amount. But
They're
I
going
didn't
to pick it
kind
up.
of...
So you were the detective tapped with solving these cases?
Yeah, I was. And I looked at them all and I connected quite a few. It was quite clear that it was one man. So fortunately, 2 of those rapes that I picked up from Otara, Idaho, had exhibits still on them. I sent them through to the ESR and they came back, same offender as the one we're looking at in Manurewa. So that's when it was confirmed that we knew what we were looking at. The ESR had already confirmed that we were looking at one man, and now we knew that we were looking at one man that had come from Otahu back in the late 80s. So yeah, here we were.
So the things that you noticed, victims were mostly under 15. The youngest was just 10.
Yep.
Their homes were typically near parks. Entry into the house was the same. A knife was taken by the property to gain control. Same or similar language used. Form of assault the same. And also never any fingerprints left at the scene. So you're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, there's enough here for us to think we've got one person driving all this.
One other thing that is important in there is when you have a one-off rape, quite often there's a smell of alcohol. They come home from a party and they see a window open, so they jump in and rape somebody. Opportunistic, boozed. No booze on this guy's breath. Same with Rewa. No booze. These guys are out looking. They're targeting, and they weren't boozed.
So then it was you and John Manning. Talk briefly about John Manning, because he figures significantly during this period.
Absolutely. John Manning, after we'd been going for a while, we did centre our inquiry in Manukau. We had all sorts of issues with staff, which is always a case in the police, and particularly in South Auckland at the time. And, you know, we didn't have enough police to investigate the crime that were happening every day. So to drag people off out of different investigative groups was difficult. And finally, we had a real bloodbath in Papatoe, one of the rapes, and John Manning, who was a detective inspector, who I'd worked with for a long time, he took over control of the inquiry and pulled in a few other very important players, and then we started again, basically, because all our conventional investigative methods were drawing big blanks.
So Manning was the one who picked up some of the overseas stuff, and as you mentioned the book Mindhunter, which was fairly famous for its time.
Yeah.
But also, so you guys were looking overseas, looking at the profiling stuff, and then start to bring that back into New Zealand.
Yeah, that's what happened. And John put a plan together. And
so this was Operation Park.
Operation Park plan, yeah. It was the profiling, beginning of criminal profiling. We'd already done a lot of behavioural stuff that joined it all together, but now people get confused between behavioural analysis and criminal profiling.
What is the difference?
They kind of go together. Behavioural analysis is looking at a crime scene. It's what John Douglas said in Mindhunter. You know, if you want to understand Picasso, look at his paintings. And if you want to understand your rapist, look at his crime scene. That's behavioural analysis. You look at it and you see there's certain behaviours that he has to carry out. He has to climb the window. He has to do this. He has to get control of the victim, and he has to penetrate her to be a rape, and all these kind of things are a modus operandi, you know, MO. But there are some things they do that they don't have to do in order to complete the act, and they are the ritualistic behaviours, you know.
So that's the behavioural.
That's a behavioural analysis. Now, the criminal profiling is different altogether. You look at all that you know about the crime, and you take a bit of a big step. It's not evidential. Behavioural analysis can be evidential, whereas profiling isn't. Profiling is just trying to select or get a smaller number of suspects from tens of thousands of people that could possibly be your offender. So you say, right, are we looking at in the case of Joe Thompson, the ghost, we're looking at a Maori or Pacific Islander. This is the beginning, probably aged between 25 and 35, something like that. Small build, going from the consistent descriptions of him, because he's covered up. We know we're looking for a burglar because he's got into the house. He doesn't leave fingerprints. He's probably been convicted of fingerprints before. That kind of thing is what a profile is all about. And when you put all those together, then you draw from the Wanganui computer, as we did. And I make this sound very simplistic, but it was a major process.
Well, no, because I remember this when this thing was all unraveling. That, you know, put yourself. So imagine people putting yourself in the position of yourself and Manning. You've got, I think you worked it out, 4,500 people fit the overall profile of what you've got. That's almost effectively useless.
Yeah.
Then you target it down a bit. I think one of the issues was that you picked the top age had been 35. Yeah. Thompson was 37 at the time, but nonetheless, by narrowing it, you got your suspect list down to 100.
Well, we got our suspect list down to manageable amount. I'm not sure what the numbers were now, but it's important that we by this stage we actually had more staff. They come from all over the country. It was a massive manhunt by this stage, and that was because of the political, media, public, internal police, external.
So you're still,
pressure is kind of bringing all the staff together and big operation.
I can imagine because I can remember the media, the coverage at the time. I remember news stories about police officers were hiding in trees. I don't know if that actually happened, but that was certainly in the media. So I remember this happening at the time. So obviously the media were demanding that you catch this guy, which creates a problem, I think. And so credit to you that you caught the right guy, and don't just grab some guy, the first guy that confessed. But you're sitting there in a situation where you've got vast numbers of potential suspects. You narrow it down, then you begin the process of the blood work. So then you've got because I think you say in the book you narrowed it down to in the first tranche 100. Thompson wasn't in that first list. But then you go through the process of elimination, and you're going to get bloods off these people. And I guess if it's not you, you hand over the sample, right? Mm-hmm. But what happens, I mean, if I'm in that situation, and I know I didn't do it, but I don't want the police to have my DNA, what happens then?
Well, they were given a promise that it would be destroyed.
Destroyed. Okay, so it was only
it
for
was
the purpose
destroyed.
of elimination. Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
only for the purpose of elimination, and we even had the option of taking saliva tests if they refused to give blood for some religious or some other reason.
Monty, you did have some, because you had a pair of boots. Was it John Bull boots that you were? So this wasn't the only line of inquiry you were pursuing. There was some hard evidence that you thought, and a jacket which turned out to be of no use. But so there were other lines of inquiry.
Of course there was. Yeah, there were. And the John Bull inquiries would have been perfect, and had it not been for the recording of the companies who they'd given boots to. And the funny thing was that, or the ridiculous thing was that Joe, of course, was working probably a kilometre away from our base in Wirrie, and he did have the boots, but the company didn't record him as having them. And then when we locked him up that day, the week before, when the result come in,
threw them out.
DNA, he had thrown them out just 1 week before we went in there. It didn't matter, as it turned out, but yeah, it doesn't all go according to the TV dramas, unfortunately.
Okay. So here is the one thing that I do not understand about this case. Thompson gave, I think it was a swab, wasn't it?
Yep.
Why did he do that?
I think
he didn't have to.
Yep.
Legally, he was entitled to say no.
Yep.
Yet he did it.
Then we would have been looking at, taking blood from his family and linking them that way. So
But did you have the right to do that then? Because I know that comes in later.
Yeah, it comes into it with Rewa. We knew about it, I think, back in those days. But I mean, you would immediately draw suspicion on you if you just said, "No, I'm not going to give it to you." Why?
But then I'd rather be a suspect. Suspicion upon suspicion equals suspicion, as you quote in the book at one point. So, what was it? Had he just had enough? Was it an element of just the pressure at the time? I mean, it just seems incongruous to me, because he had. I think you mentioned in there that he had above average IQ, so he must have known that giving that swab was to some extent self-destructive.
Yeah.
Yet he did it.
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, number one is probably the best person to answer that question would be Joe. And secondly, I think if you go back into his childhood, you'll find that he was known as Bonus Thompson.
He
loved
authority.
Authority. He got on with authority. He liked boys' homes when he was there. They threw him out on the street, and he was back into his old neglect and abandonment. And he liked to get on with you. And that interview, I mean, we interviewed him for 20 hours.
So let's just we'll come back to that in a sec. Yep. So this goes in two stages. You get the indication that it's probably him, but you don't have the full swab to give you the right to arrest. So there was about a month.
Yeah, there is.
That you knew you had him, but you not enough to arrest him.
Yeah, we had to wait for that second band, I think they called it in those days, to come in. It's of course changed these days, but that's how it was then. And so we had to put him under observation. We had to keep an eye on him. We couldn't afford to have another rape while
you had a helicopter fly over the area at one point to dissuade him.
Yeah,
without triggering his. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, we had a guy sitting up a tree right beside his house. And,
that was where the tree story. Okay.
Yeah, that's where the tree story was. He was an ex-army police officer. It was the middle of winter, remember? We're talking July here. And,
I hope he got a medal for that.
I don't
Citation.
He loved it because that was what he was kind of brought up on. Tying himself in a tree and in the worst of weather. And he made out he enjoyed it. Whether he did or not, I guess we'll never know. But so he knew that this guy, that Joe, had gone out, and he contacted us. And Richard Middleton was in charge of supervising that last month, and he put the cars out with their lights on and the eagle up in the air and flushed Joe back to the house. And so what he was up to, goodness only knows, but I don't think it was good.
Then talk about the arrests.
Yeah.
You knock on the door, and Joe opens the door, and this is surreal.
Yeah, it is. And it was kind of anticlimactic, really. I was with Brett Simpson. He was OC suspect, so he was in charge of the
I
arrest.
see, sorry.
So, officer in charge, yep.
Right.
We knock on the door, and he said, I've been waiting for you guys, expecting you guys. And I have to get my jacket and hat, I think, was it, or shoes or something or other. And
Jacket, yeah.
and he said, oh, yeah, Dave.
He knew your name.
Yeah, Simpo introduced me, and he said, oh, you're Dave Henwood. I was going to ring you, of course, he never was going to, but it was just, whew.
So from the moment he gave the swab, he must have suspected that you guys, because there wasn't a lot of DNA to go on, but there were a couple of slivers that you guys had. So maybe he was hoping that there was no DNA, because he was careful in that respect.
Not so. Not as much as. No, he left DNA around.
Okay.
A bit. I mean, it was how many cases were DNA linked? I don't know. Can't remember now. But quite a few. And then, of course, the rest were all behavioural, and he admitted to them. So, there was probably 16 or so DNA linked rapes. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But there was quite a few, and I don't think he was that careful with the DNA. He was careful with fingerprints, but of course, you got to remember 1993 or 1990 and some of those earlier rapes, the first time anybody had been picked up for or convicted on DNA was Colin Pitchfork in 1985, 86, something like that.
This is before CSI.
Yeah, in the UK. So, it was new stuff. I know it's kind of old hat now, but it was really kind of
maybe it didn't
new then. Rayward didn't know about it either until we put a whole lot of media out there.
I don't go to Rayward. He was such an interesting character. The contrast between him and Thompson is also very interesting. But you talk about the time that you spent with him. So it was obviously over a couple of days. You spent a long time. You just allow him to talk. He's obviously resigned to his situation. He's not fighting it, and he just runs with it. Then he says at one point, I get this urge, like getting hungry for a feed. I don't know if it is sex or whatever it is, to have somebody in my arms, whether it is love, whether it is hate. I get this compulsion to go out and do these things, and I find when I'm out there doing it, I can't stop, and I can't let anybody stop me doing it. I feel remorse and guilt, and I feel shit afterwards. And then suddenly I get the urge again, and I push all of that shit aside, and I go out and I do it again. There's actually quite a lot going on in that little.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm going to assume that this is an honest reflection of what he's thinking. He knows it's wrong, right? Because he says, I feel shit. But then he has to push that feeling aside to go out there and do this thing again. So he has to override his own humanity in a way to go and fulfill this need that he's doing. So he knows what he's doing is wrong.
Yeah, he does know what he's doing is wrong, but I don't think he's as you say pushes aside as I think he's fairly narcissistic, really. I mean, pushing all that shit aside. We're talking about raping 10-year-old girls. It's not just pushing a little bit of shit aside, is it really? I mean, what he's been doing is brutally dishonest and shocking, really. I mean, and it went on for so many years. I don't think he felt very much remorse at all, to be honest.
Well, no, because you say at one point talking about the infections that he got.
Yeah.
And you describe him as being narcissistic.
I think so, because he talks about we'll just stick with that one for a moment. He is very he's thought about that, and he's coming out. I think that's his honest interpretation, but that's from his point of view. But he's a what is he? It's honest, but he doesn't. He's not revealing that much about himself, really.
I don't know. I think because when he says, why do you feel shit? Why do you feel bad about yourself? You feel bad because you know what you've done is wrong, but then he does it again. I mean, he obviously had no problem putting that stuff aside because he did it so many times. I think there was 129 convictions, 70 incidents. So he obviously had no problem doing it, but this was not a lion chasing a gazelle, right? He knew what he was doing was an evil thing, and he didn't care, and he kept doing it.
Yeah.
And
that little passage there defines a serial rapist. He can't stop because each time he goes out, he's trying to get some sort of satisfaction, but of course he's never going to. So next time he thinks, "Oh, I've got to do better. I'll get it right this time," and he keeps going out and out and out, but it'll never satisfy him. So he's just going to keep going, and that's the definition of a serial rapist. And you will have there somewhere the psychiatrist's kind of view of Joe, and I think that's quite telling as well.
The one that says that he is going to murder at some point.
Yeah, that's where he was heading.
But he never did.
No.
So he did it for 12 years and never.
Yeah, but it was getting more serious as it went along. Some of those later ones, particularly one in Papatoe before John Manning joined us, that was a bloodbath, and the earlier ones hadn't been. But then it depends, I suppose, a little bit on the resistance that he received. But he was willing to beat that girl. She was a 14-year-old girl in Papatoe, beat her senseless. But we hadn't seen that before.
So he was escalating.
Right. Was.
Okay. Let's talk. So his story goes on, obviously, but your story, your involvement kind of comes to an end, and then you're kind of the go-to guy, I guess. And then we get caught up into Operation Atlas and Operation, what was the other one?
Harvey.
Operation Harvey, which so now we're moving from South Auckland to Mount Eden, that sort of area.
Mm.
So I want to talk, I don't want to sort of go back too much into it, because I think the trajectory between Rewa and Thompson from your perspective is kind of similar. You realize, okay, you've got Atlas and you've got Harvey, and at some point you realize, hey, these two are connected. You find a rape, I think, from was it 1988 in Rotorua? Was that?
Yeah, that was.
Was that Rewa?
Yeah, it was Rewa.
Okay, so you work out you've got one guy. You go through the process. He gets captured. When he is arrested. Actually, I just want to come back to you're doing the profiling, but then Rewa gets snapped because he has an attempted abduction or rape, and the victim sees his car registration, which is a car that leads back to him.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it that gave that allowed you to haul in Rewa?
Right. Well,
and talk about the DNA of his family, because that's really interesting.
Well, yeah, we wanted to. Did we have him? Yeah, we didn't. We had it later. Yeah. Okay, so this was the attack by Newmarket there on this girl. I believe that the offender was spiralling Rewa was spiralling out of control, because all his other attacks were well planned and carried out. This was a random kind of attack on the street, and that's why he got identified through it. And then, of course, we had. When you put him through the computer, he was wanted for attack in Ponsonby. He was wanted. He had connections to the areas where all the other rapes had taken place. So we thought, okay, this guy is pretty.
Was he on your radar before the?
Yeah, well, he was on the DNA profiling lists. So he was there a number of times. We did the same list as we did for Joe Thompson.
But you didn't have Rewa's DNA.
Didn't have his DNA because he'd played hard to get. Anyway, you couldn't find him. Just like that's what why we had problems with him. Why the Central Police had problems with him for that attack in Ponsonby earlier in '95.
They let him go. That's another story. Yep.
Yeah, well, they let him go, but they didn't have much option really. They didn't have enough to lock him up, and he wasn't going to stay. And I think it was a mistake at the time, but there you go. It's easy after the fact, isn't it?
It is, yes.
We then thought, right, well, the best way to find him, he's not going to give us his blood, so we'll get blood from his family, and that'll link him back, and then we'll have confirmation that he's the offender, and that's what we did. Familial DNA, it's called. So,
and the family agreed?
Yeah.
Did they know why you wanted the blood?
Yeah, they did.
So they obviously had written him off.
Well, I don't know. Perhaps they didn't believe it was him. Who knows? Once again, you'd have to ask them that.
You got to hope that they knew. They knew,
they
and
must
they
have
probably
suspected.
wanted him.
He wasn't that close with his family anyway. Really, well, some members of his family, because he'd gone his own way and been whangaied out at an early age to another auntie and uncle, and abandonment, neglect, all that stuff.
So let's talk about, because there's this guy Rewa, the rapes that looks like they started in 1988. There was the murder of Susan Burdett in 1992. So far as we know, that was the only murder that he was linked to.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened there? Why? And we'll come to Teina Pora, because that's a whole little history in itself. That seems out of context. Not out of context.
Well, no,
out
it
of
doesn't.
the MO.
It doesn't. I believe that if you look at some of his attacks, there was one in Mangere just before or just after Susan's murder, and this woman was so badly beaten the family couldn't even recognise her. So they were quite violent. And if you look at Rhonda's attack in Parnell, she was hit over the head.
She's the one that wrote the book.
Yeah. And indomitable kind of character she was.
Rhonda McHardy.
Yeah. And so how out of place was it? We don't know what happened in there. There's only two people that knew what happened in that bedroom. And one was Malcolm Rewa, and he's not telling us, and the other one's Susan. So did she say something to him? Perhaps some sexual kind of conversation, or did she recognise him?
So okay. So right. So murder was always on the cards. You think?
I think so.
It's just in this particular case the circumstances warranted that action, and other circumstances, because he seems, because one of the things I find really interesting is the character of these two individuals, right? Thompson and Weir are obviously enormously different. One wants to please authority, despite the fact that he does what he does, and the other had a visceral, violent hatred right through to the very end, but not without, you asked for a blood sample, and he said, well, there's all this blood on the floor. I mean, there was so he wasn't. He obviously had a character and a personality. He was also involved in dog racing. I find there's a complexity and multi-layer to Rewa, which, if you just think about it from the perspective of the rapes, I guess you don't necessarily see, which I think makes him even more terrifying, because he's just a member of the community. And if you're part of the mammoth, whatever it is, dog racing community, maybe you wouldn't have picked up on that. So he was just a member of the community. Likewise, so was Thompson. He had a job, whatever. So the thing that makes me ponder or think is, so these are the two that we caught. How many are there that we don't caught, that leading up to the profiling and the linkage blindness that you talk about? Has this always been a feature? Have these people always been in our midst? We've only just come to our attention?
I don't think we've ever had in the past serial rapists who have committed as many rapes as these two.
But how would we know?
Well, we would know from previous, unless we go right back to the 30s or 40s when nothing was recorded. But we would. There'd be old detectives and say, oh, we had a whole lot of rapes and such. We had a whole lot of rapes over here. We had a whole lot of rapes over there. That would have come out. I mean, the same thing happened in Melbourne when we had the Melbourne rape squad DI come over and talk to us during Park. And when they kicked off their rape squad over in Melbourne, they had, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 rapes unsolved around Melbourne City. And they thought they had 10 or 11, 12 rapists. They only had 2. And they committed all of them. So it's the same thing here. I mean, of all the recorded rapes that we had, we say we had 120 or something. If you look at Raywa's and Thompson's rapes and take them out of it, we only had about 20 left. And some of them we solved later on in the historical rape thing. There was a few small series of 2 or 3, but nothing of the sheer number that we're talking about.
So what changed? Why? So I'm not sure I agree with you, because I think if 1 in 50,000 men have the capacity for serial rape, then presumably the circumstances to commit serial rape have existed, whatever. So I think there's nothing magically changed. Maybe there's something about urbanisation maybe makes it easier. I don't know. So I think that they must have been there, but for whatever reason. Or maybe there is something changed. Maybe it's the urban environment, the anonymity of a city that makes these crimes easier to commit.
Yeah, I don't think... I don't know what period of time you're talking about, but I know there have been rapists before who have committed 4 or 5 rapes. I've certainly dealt with one in another gang member, actually, and he had done, I think it was 12, 13 or something, but nothing like 50 or 30. I mean, I don't think that's really happened, and I think one of the reasons is our own fault to some degree. All those rapes in Otara, if they had been clicked off earlier, he would have been committing 50 rapes, would he? Or 70 or whatever it was in the end. He got convicted for 50, I think. But, if he'd been pinged off earlier and spent 10 years in prison, he wouldn't have been committing all those rapes.
He would have been taken
So
off,
I don't... we had that much crime. It was a real battlefield in South Auckland in the 80s, and I know because I was there, and... one of the guys that had worked on a couple of the rapes, he thought there was a serial rapist going on, but he got pulled off onto somebody else. I think it's in Jan Corbett's. I don't know if you've seen Caught by His Past. If you read that book,
yep.
He was pulled off onto that. So, there's just a sheer crime rate.
Let's talk about Teina Pora.
Right.
So I think most the listeners will know the story. She was murdered in 1992. Teina Pora confessed right from the get-go. When you arrested Rewa, you asked him the question, right? So you were alive to this issue right from, not from day one maybe, but from your involvement, you thought, hey, this is a Malcolm Rewa offence. Pora confessed. He was convicted. He was convicted twice. It just became so, but not just him. David Doherty, I think, is another case where the police, where the rest of us could look at the evidence and say, this makes no sense. What are you doing? You spoke out on Teina Pora. You got a smack on the wrist. I think quite a serious smack on the wrist. So credit for you so you spoke out internally, and ultimately you spoke out externally, and I think that is enormous credit to you. But why were the police so blinded? Why could nobody see internally? Because you said before we started, you were employed by the police, but you worked for the public. At some point there was an institutional loyalty there that blinded those police officers from doing what they must have known was the right thing. Or am I misreading that?
Yeah, I think you are a little bit. The people who were running Operation Harvey were involved in the arrest of Pora. I had nothing to do with Pora. I've never cited them to this day. But I based my reasoning on the fact that I knew Malcolm Ray was a lone wolf. He wasn't going to take this boy with him. And that was my basis for it, and I knew.
But you could
link
Rewa to the Burdett rape.
the DNA linked him to it.
Yep.
And
So everybody knew that Rewa was definitely there.
yeah,
Pora confessed, and so he was put in. So keep going.
yeah. So why would Malcolm Rewa take an 18-year-old blabbermouth from a different gang along to a rape? Not only because when you look at all his behaviour, he's a lone offender. He's knows.
Okay, but that wasn't the question. The question was why did the institution,
Yep.
when it should have been obvious, because you were in there, you could see there's something amiss here.
Not just me. There was others that also believed that Pora was not there, but there was others who were running the inquiry who believed that he was, and they had arrested Pora themselves. So they, it's not a democracy. We can't all. There's always going to be disagreement about things.
He did confess, to be fair,
and he put himself in there, and they couldn't get away from that. They couldn't, well, why would someone confess to a murder when they weren't even there? But anyway, so they went forward with and kept him in prison, and they tried to link Pora to Rewa, which was pretty dubious kind of linkage in my view. But still, I always knew that there was two problems here. One was Teina Pora was sitting in prison for 20 years for something he didn't do, and even if he'd been in prison for 2 or 3 years for being a stupid boy, I wouldn't have minded so much. But 20 years is a hell of a long time, for being an idiot. And the other thing, and just as important, was we were never going to convict Malcolm Rewa while Teina Pora was in the way. So we had to kind of. So that's why later on, when things kind of turned a bit messy, I wasn't as angry with the people who honestly believed Pora was there. It was later on that I got annoyed because all we needed to do was have an internal investigation.
But why didn't that happen? I guess that's my question, Chook. Why was the institution unable to do that?
You tell me. I don't know. To this day, they haven't had an investigation into what happened. So if they had done that, they would have found a lot of senior detectives in South Auckland who would have put their hand up and spoken and said, yeah, he wasn't there. I've never believed he was there. These were guys that were involved in the first interview of him. But they maybe they were legally tied up by this stage. I don't know, but it never happened, and it went on, and then what happened in the end. I got I was worried that I knew it was always going to come out in the end because a blind man in the dark could have seen what was coming, and I told them that when I got the hand smacked, and what would happen when the wave crashed on the shore, and we could have got some sort of tiny bit of credibility out of it, but that didn't happen, and so it went the whole hog, and that's where we ended up.
Is there anything in this book we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about?
I don't think so. The profiling unit that we set up after Harvey.
This is after you left being a sworn police officer.
No, I was still sworn when I set that up. It was Peter Mitford Burgess, myself, and Lambo initially, and Mary Goddard come on later on. So, and it's still going.
What's it called?
We were doing
National.
It's called Behavioural Unit now. Yeah, and it's still going, which is great. And see, we're never going to have, for a number of reasons, we're never going to have serial rapists like that again because of DNA and because of the Behavioural Unit.
Yeah,
and so that's a big plus. And we did solve a lot of rapes while we were in the profiling unit. I gave expert evidence all over the country, and it was great for the victims because you tied 2 or 3 crimes together.
Yeah,
and then they'd have the support of each other. Whereas if they went on their own, it's just one victim you got to knock over. Whereas if you've got 3 of them, it's a bit difficult. So yeah, it was all very good. We kind of progressed things quite a bit, I think. It's never going to be perfect, but I mean, court system's set up for the defendant, and rightfully so. So where we are.
They catch us in the end. Okay, Chook, thank you so much. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you, because you've obviously had an outsized influence, and I think an outside influence massively for the positive. Your engagement with people like Dan Dudson and the Josie twins, I think, is interesting, and I think it's a credit to you. And I think it's a sign of I wouldn't criticise policemen now for not doing it. I think that's just the way that New Zealand has evolved and changed probably makes that sort of stuff much more difficult now than perhaps it would have been when we were a bit younger than what we are now.
Right.
Thank you.
No,
Cheers.
Cheers.